Welcome back to Mornings. Lily Arthur is joining us, and Lily was forced to give up her baby for adoption in the 60s. Our psychologist Ian Wallace joins us. A very difficult time after the birth, 6 weeks after the birth of your baby, Lily, you were put on a plane and sent back to your mother in Sydney with your family, 7 kids and a stepfather.
Yes.
What did your mother say then?
I think everybody wanted to not speak about it. It was just something that nobody even dared to go to. Well, I've never spoken to my mother
sort of
about
ostracised in our society then, weren't they?
Well, basically after you'd lost your baby, you know, that was the end of it. They considered it to be the final episode in that particular chapter. But, I mean, we were basically forced into silence because of the silence of everybody else around us. It was a huge amount of shame of having lost a child that basically silenced the majority of women like myself. But
Ian, adoption practices today, well, there's so few adoptions anyway, but what happens and the change in our attitudes now?
There's a massive change, because back at this time there was 10,000 Australian kids adopted a year. Now we're down to less than 150. So it's rapid. Now we prepare people for it, we talk them through it beforehand, and after we give them a lot of follow-up. When most of these girls, the opposite happened, they were actually ostracised. They were taken away from everyone. They're often made to think they were really unfit people before it to convince them to give up the baby immediately. And most of them got no counselling after. I mean, many of the women I saw were put on a train 3 days later and sent back to Sydney, and there was no follow-up. And then, as Lil says, the family sort of look at it as an unfortunate incident, so we just won't talk about that. We'll pretend it didn't actually ever occur.
So for all these people, and as you say, there are 10,000 babies a year being given up for adoption, so there's so many people with a lot of pain in their heart and emotional distress. What do we do now? Because it doesn't go away.
Well, it doesn't. It's often triggered by later events. A lot of the women that I see now, it's when they had a baby many years later, or it's interesting, some of them are now grandmas, and as they watch their child have a baby, they're getting massive post-traumatic effects. So they're suddenly having anxiety attacks or panic attacks, or they're getting very depressed. Even though they may now be 60 or 70 years old, it keeps coming back. So what we really need to do is address that, get support for those women, to get them heard, to let them talk about how what happened to them, because many have never ever discussed it with anyone.
And I know that's clearly what you want to happen. The people who have had to go through the same trauma as you. This must be a very familiar story for you, Lily.
it's a familiar story to 150,000 women like myself.
In fact, last week when you mentioned this on the program, this email we received, only a week ago I made the comment, when is someone going to do a story on the children whose own children were forcibly lost? I was pregnant at 16. My baby was born a week after turning 17. I waited 24 years to wrap my arms around my son for the first time. His father and I did eventually marry and have 3 beautiful daughters. When life has ever seemed too difficult to get through and seems to have too many challenges, I remember that young girl, and nothing in my life has or could be compared to the loss of that time. I mean, that's
interesting she says that young girl, but because a lot of these people almost depersonalise the experience, because that's how it was set up. They were made to believe this is not you, and so when I talk to them, they talk about almost another person going through that experience, not them.
Do you remember who you are on that note then, Lily? Are you a different person to that 16-year-old who experienced this?
I went into a home, and for 9 months I was my name was changed, so I took on the personality of that person. When I came out, it was another person entirely that went through that experience. Could never ever connect up with that period of my life.
So what do we do now? What is your greatest wish now?
My greatest wish is that we have a national inquiry. We need to have it put down on the record that this was one of the greatest human rights crimes to happen to women and their children in this country. 150,000 women lost their children to past adoption practices. And I think, you know, with the acknowledgement to the stolen generations and to the British child migrants and to the state wards, we too should have the same acknowledgement of the unlawful and immoral practices that went on with adoption practices from the 1950s through to the year 2000.
On the other hand, a lot of the authorities at the time thought they were doing the right thing. What is your response to those who, with the greatest kindness in their heart, thought they were doing the right thing? Because that was practice of the day.
Well, they might have thought that they were doing the right thing, and it may have been practice of the day. But the simple fact was that they were deliberately and knowingly breaking the law and knew that they were causing harm to mothers like myself.
What can be done now? These 150,000 women, as Lily is trying to help now, what do we do?
You do need to seek professional counselling, because many of those people now have massive problems because of it. Unfortunately, when we get people back together, it's not always a success story. It's really important they talk about their experiences, they share their experiences, because many of them never talked about it ever in their life. It's really important they learn from other cases that have been successful and how to get over this stuff. Important too, don't let this whole thing define you. It's really easy to let that process define you. And what we're trying to do is people say, look, that happened to you, but also move on. Try and work out how you can lead the rest of your life. Don't let just that process define you for the rest of your life.
Such an issue. This email just came through from Tony. I'm just watching the piece on the single mum who had a child taken away from her. I'm one of 2 kids that was taken from their mother at birth by the Catholic Church and placed in an abusive family by the church who knew the father was very promiscuous. I've recently been reunited with my brother and mother after not knowing either for over 40 years. And that's from Tony. So clearly this issue is such an important one for so many people.
Because there's lots of women like Lil who are older women who are still really traumatised by this and still need help. And they're a bit of a silent generation. They didn't talk about it, and that's what we're trying to get them to do now. Talk about it, get some support so you can learn to deal with all those feelings. Communication's the key. Lily, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Ian.
And Ian, as always, great to have you with us.
Pleasure.
We've got more coming up on Mornings, but first here's Jamie.
The Bean Combo can help you lose weight, tone and tighten your body when you use it for 10 minutes a day. Here's Lucy. Hey, Lucy.
Hello, Jamie. Now, you know that we've seen the Bean over the last 18 months, and we've seen how the FlexTan makes it a complete at-home work tool. Now, listen to this. Call TVP Direct on 1300